From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
There's been times where I drive by and I just start crying because, you know, it's right behind my house and I don't know. And I think that's the worst part, is not knowing what's actually going on in there. And just hoping that they're okay.
A major U.S. military and CIA contractor has been caught detaining dozens of migrant children inside a vacant Phoenix office building with dark windows, no kitchen, only a few toilets. We'll speak with Reveal's Aura Bagado, who broke the story. Then we go to the U.S. border in Texas, where we continue our conversation with human rights lawyer Jennifer Harberry on how today's refugee crisis is blowback from U.S. foreign policy in Central America.
Our government helped to create the cartels. Most of the heads of the cartels are former military intelligence leaders who were trained in the United States, armed by the United States, worked carefully with the United States during the genocide era.
We'll also speak with Jennifer Harberry about her husband, Efraim Bamaka Velasquez, the Mayan comandante who was tortured and murdered by the Guatemalan army in the 80s. After her massive protest campaign, Harberry exposed the U.S. role and cover-up in his death. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump slated to announce his nominee to replace retiring Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy tonight. The nomination is poised to cement the Supreme Court's conservative majority, vastly reshaping the court for decades to come. President Trump is reportedly considering 4 potential nominees. Judge Amy Coney Barrett is the favored nominee among the religious right. The New York Times reports she says she would like to see the scope of abortion rights changed. Barrett's a member of the obscure Catholic group People of Praise, which Vox reports requires members to swear an oath of loyalty and give each other input on personal life decisions. Judge Brett Kavanaugh is an appellate judge from Maryland who's ruled against Obamacare and abortion rights in the past. Last fall, he joined a panel of judges in issuing an order to prevent an undocumented immigrant teenager in U.S. detention from obtaining an abortion. That decision was later overturned. Raymond Kethledge is a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit who's been dubbed Gorsuch 2.0. He's ruled against voting rights. CBS also reports he's a staunch supporter of the Second Amendment. Judge Thomas Hardiman is a U.S. Appeals Court judge that the Washington Post reports is a Second Amendment extremist. The Post reports his replacement on the court could lead to a vast expansion in legal gun ownership and that he's been sympathetic to anti-abortion activists in past rulings. This is President Trump speaking to reporters Sunday.
I'm getting very close to making a final decision.
Not yet.
And I believe this person will do a great job. But I'm very close to making a decision. Have not made it official yet, obviously. Have not made it final, but we're very close to making a decision.
How many people are you deciding between?
Well, it's still, let's say it's the 4 people, and they're excellent. Everyone, you can't go wrong.
North Korea has accused the Trump administration of pushing a unilateral and gangster-like demand for denuclearization following Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's 2 days of talks in the North Korean capital, Pyongyang. Pompeo did not meet with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un during his visit, although he did meet with senior North Korean officials. Following the meeting, North Korean Foreign Ministry said the attitude and demands from the U.S. side during the high-level talks were nothing short of deeply regrettable. Pompeo said the talks were productive. The high-level talks come after President Trump met face-to-face with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in a historic summit in Singapore less than a month ago. President Trump's headed to Europe Tuesday to meet with European leaders at the NATO summit in Brussels. In advance of the summit, Trump reportedly sent sharply worded letters to the leaders of Germany, Belgium, Norway, Canada, and other NATO allies, complaining they're spending too little on military. This week's summit comes after Trump lashed out at European allies during the G7 summit in Quebec last month. After his trip to Brussels, Trump's expected to visit London, where widespread protests are planned against his visit. He's then set to travel to his private golf courses in Scotland, the Trump Turnberry in Ayrshire, and then fly to Helsinki for a summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin on July 16th. In San Diego, a federal judge will hold a hearing today on whether to delay Tuesday's deadline that mandated the reunification of all children under the age of 5 whom the Trump administration separated from their parents at the border. Under court order, the Justice Department released the names of more than 100 children under 5 years old. The Trump administration's claiming it needs more time to match children with their parents, including at least 19 parents the Trump administration deported already. The American Civil Liberties Union says less than half the separated children under the age of 5 will be reunited by Tuesday. Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar has admitted nearly 3,000 children were separated from their parents by the Trump administration. He'd previously claimed, just a few weeks before, that only 2,047 children were separated. We'll have more on the Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy and immigration crackdown after headlines. The New York Times reports the Trump administration stunned public health officials and foreign diplomats at the World Health Assembly in Geneva by seeking unsuccessfully to derail a resolution to encourage breastfeeding and to instead promote the interests of the billion-dollar infant formula industry. The U.S. officials reportedly first tried to water down the resolution. When that failed, the officials reportedly told Ecuador if it introduced the measure, Washington would withdraw aid to Ecuador and unleash punishing trade measures. Ultimately, after a slew of other nations refused to introduce the measure in fear of retaliation, Russia stepped in and U.S. officials backed off from the threats. In southwest Japan, flooding and landslides from record rainfall have killed at least 95 people and forced 2 million more to flee their homes. Dozens more are still missing. Scientists have linked heavy rainfall and increased flooding to climate change. In Turkey, the president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, will be sworn in today for another 5-year term as president with sweeping new powers. Ahead of his swearing in, his government fired another 18,000 state workers as part of a far-reaching crackdown on civil society following the failed military coup 2 years ago. In total, Erdogan's government has fired nearly 150,000 people and arrested tens of thousands of human rights activists, lawyers, academics, journalists, political dissidents, and Kurds. In a historic development in East Africa, Ethiopia and Eritrea have reestablished diplomatic ties after a nearly 2-decade-long border dispute that killed tens of thousands of people in the late 90s. The leaders of the two countries met for a landmark meeting in Eritrea's capital Asmara over the weekend, in which the two leaders agreed to reopen embassies in their respective capitals and resume flights between the two countries. Eritrea also agreed to allow landlocked Ethiopia to use Eritrean ports on the Red Sea. This weekend's summit was the first the leaders of the two countries had met face-to-face in nearly 20 years. This is the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed.
If there is peace between Ethiopian and Eritrean people, the Horn of Africa region will be a region of peace and development. Our people, who live scattered as refugees in humiliation, will come back with dignity. Our citizens will not be sold and exchanged like commodities.
In Haiti, thousands participated in anti-austerity protests in the capital Port-au-Prince after Haiti's Commerce and Economic Ministries announced massive fuel price increases late Friday night as part of austerity measures being imposed on Haiti by the International Monetary Fund. The government quickly canceled the fuel price increases after the massive protests in which at least 2 people were killed and luxury foreign hotels attacked. U.S. airliners have canceled flights to Haiti amidst the protests. In Brazil, a legal and political battle has erupted after a judge ordered former president and current presidential frontrunner, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, to be released from prison as he appeals a corruption conviction he says is politically motivated. Hours after the Sunday morning ruling, a second judge overruled the order. Lula remains in jail. His supporters gathered outside the prison Sunday during the legal battle. This is Gleice Hoffman, a lawmaker from Lula's Workers' Party.
It can't be so much maneuvering for Lula to stay imprisoned. Why does Lula need to be imprisoned when he has the right to be released? Why this maneuvering from the Brazilian court and the federal police in this slow-paced operation Lula's freedom, taking their time with administrative moves that are not legal? This is embarrassing for Brazil in the face of the world.
To see our interview with former President Lula, go to DemocracyNow.org. In Thailand, 7 boys from a youth soccer team have been freed so far from the underwater cave where they've been trapped for over 2 weeks. Rescuers are undertaking a major effort to free the final 5 boys and their coach who remain trapped in the cave. And in Washington, D.C., federal prosecutors have dropped all charges against all remaining defendants who were arrested at President Trump's Inauguration Day Disrupt 720 protests, January 2017. Prosecutors has initially threatened over 200 people, including journalists, with a slew of felony charges that carried sentences up to 60 years in prison. The dismissal of all remaining charges remains prosecutors failed to win a single conviction in front of a jury related to the protests during Trump's inauguration. To see our full coverage of the J20 protests and the protest trials, go to DemocracyNow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In San Diego, California, a federal judge will hold a hearing today on whether to delay Tuesday's deadline that mandated the reunification of all children under the age of 5 whom the Trump administration separated from their parents at the border. Under court order, the Justice Department released the names of more than 100 children under 5 who were separated from their parents. The Trump administration's claiming it needs more time to match children with their parents, including at least 19 parents the Trump administration has deported already. The American Civil Liberties Union says less than half the separated children under the age of 5 will be reunited by Tuesday. According to Judge Dana Sabra's ruling, all separated children must be reunited with their parents by July 26. Last week, HHS Secretary Alex Azar told reporters there are nearly 3,000 separated children in government custody, a figure almost 1,000 children more than the 2,047 his department released over a week ago. Well, for more on the unfolding crisis of separated families, we turn to a new investigation by Reveal, exposing how a major U.S. military and CIA contractor has been detaining dozens of migrant children inside a vacant Phoenix office building with dark windows, no kitchen, and only a few toilets. The building was leased in March by MVM. Military contractor, Reveal reports, has received nearly $250 million in contracts to transport immigrant children since 2014. One local resident filmed children in sweatsuits being led into the building, with one so young that they had to be carried. After Reveal published its story Friday, policymakers spoke out against the facility, and donations of toys were left out front in a gift bag with the words "Stay Strong," along with a large dollhouse. For more, we go to Oakland, California, where we're joined by the lead reporter on the story, Aura Bogado, immigration reporter for Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting. Aura, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about what you found.
Thanks, Amy. A few weeks ago, White House Chief of Staff John Kelly said that the children who were being taken from their parents at the border would be placed in foster care or whatever. Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting has been laser focused on what that whatever means. Although we don't know for a fact that these children were indeed separated from their parents at the border, we believe that may be the case because, as you mentioned, some of the children are so young that they don't look like they're old enough to walk. I know from my many years as an immigration reporter that children who do cross the desert or who do turn themselves in at a port of entry tend to be teenagers, sometimes preteens. We've never seen toddlers who are unaccompanied. And so for that reason, we believe that these children may have been separated from their parents, and now we have a better idea of what that whatever may mean. In this case, a contractor, a private contractor with heavy ties to the CIA, in fact, it was founded by ex-CIA secret agents, had an office in which neighbors described dozens of children going in over the span of several weeks and never leaving until 3 weeks later. We were able to obtain video of 32 of those children entering that facility, and this is in an unmarked, unmapped, unlicensed, largely vacant office building right there in Phoenix.
Aura, you tweeted, "This story was made possible by a tipster, Leanna Dunlap. She was brave enough to take video and ask questions. Our team worked nonstop for a week. We found the contractor. ICE had to issue a comment. I want to turn to Leanna Dunlap in a recent Reveal interview as she describes her response to seeing white vans filled with immigrant children pulling up to the vacant office building behind her house June 4th. The next day, she videotaped more children being led into the building. Dunlap says she never saw children leave or go outside during the next 3 weeks.
A lot of times I would just stare out my window waiting to see something, or late at night I would go out my backyard and just look at that window waiting to see if I could hear anything or see any lights. It's just like, if there are kids in there and they have those windows blocked off, they're not even seeing sunlight, and how long have they had them in there? There's been times where I drive by and I just start crying because, you know, it's right behind my house and I don't know. And I think that's the worst part, is not knowing what's actually going on in there. And just hoping that they're okay.
That's Leanna Dunlap, your tipster out of Bogado. Some have described this as a black site for migrant children.
Yes, I was just texting with Liana a few minutes before this segment. You know, Liana was concerned the first time that she saw this happen. I saw texts that she exchanged with her husband on the 4th of June, and she said something very weird is going on. I think the children are being trafficked. She subsequently takes video. She confronted workers. She talked to her friends about it. She called the police. Because one of the workers sort of casually said, like, well, if you have a problem with it, call the police. And so she did so. We spoke with the Phoenix Police Department, who did confirm that they responded to a call. However, when they found out that this was an ICE contractor that was involved, they apparently didn't continue or maybe even start an investigation. So Liana had turned to local media and then turned to us. I think from a moment of frustration and wanting to really know what happened with these children, what's going on here. Our team of investigators got on the story right away. I was on the next flight to Phoenix the following morning, and I went straight from the airport to Liana's house. And that office is indeed right in front of her house. And then back at the office, we had our great team of researchers and reporters really start digging into this property, the history of its property. We found that in March, MVM, this private contractor, signed a 5-year lease. This is 1 month before Attorney General Jeff Sessions announces zero policy. In June, when we start hearing reports of of children being separated at the border, that's when Liana and her neighbors first started seeing children. They didn't know. They told me that they had no idea that these could have been immigrant children. They thought maybe these were just children who were being trafficked for some kind of work and who are being abused. And they then see the reports of immigrant children. You know, President Trump then cancels his own policy of separating families at the border on the 20th of June. 2 days later is when neighbors report seeing all of those van loads of children leaving. Some neighbors estimate that it was around 40 children who left that facility on the 22nd of June. Others, Liana, tells me that it was as many as 80 kids who were in there.
I mean, she calls the police because she's concerned that whatever this entity was at the time, they were engaged in human trafficking. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement confirmed to you, to Reveal, that it had entered into a contract with MVM. My spokesperson, Jennifer Elzias, said the companies, quote, authorized to use their office spaces as waiting areas for minors awaiting same-day transportation between U.S. Customs and Border Protection custody and U.S. Health and Human Services custody. Meanwhile, a statement posted on MVM's website June 18th reads, the current services MVM provides consist of transporting undocumented families and and unaccompanied children to Department of Health and Human Services designated facilities. We have not and currently do not operate shelters or any other type of housing for minors. Talk more about what you understand is this company ICE has contracted with and the amount of money they have gotten.
MVM, when we first contacted them, they stated what you just read. We're not in the business of providing shelter or any kind of housing for children at all whatsoever. As it became more clear to them that we had a lot of evidence that many children were being detained for some period of time in this office building, they said, well, this is a temporary holding place. That's the term that MVM has used to describe it, a temporary holding place. ICE didn't respond immediately. I believe any reporter who works on immigration sort of takes that as a given. ICE responds when it wants to respond and when it feels a need to respond. They eventually did respond, Jennifer Elzea then telling me that under its contract, this private contractor, MVM, is allowed to have children in an office setting used as a waiting area. But you know, when you think about a waiting area, it tends to be, in my experience, it has always been an area in which I wait immediately before I speak with perhaps an DMV worker, or perhaps before I immediately board my flight. A waiting area doesn't tend to be a way station, a detention area. As you said, some people have described this as a black site, and I think that speaks to the unmarked, unlicensed nature of this office building. This is a plain office building.
You looked inside the Phoenix office building where they're being detained and published a photograph of what you saw: a child's booster seat, box labeled baby shampoo, inflatable mattress, medication schedule.
We didn't publish the medication schedule because there is some what we believe to be private information about at least one of the children who was being held there, likely a lot more. We see some names on there, and there is a medication schedule. It has a partial A number. That's an identifier that ICE and other immigration authorities use to track undocumented immigrants through its system. And it has a name, and it says medication at 0900 hours. I'm not sure how to say that in military time. That kind of medication schedule, that's interesting because as any of us who ever take medication on doctor's orders know that we need to take it, once daily, twice daily. That's something that indicates that perhaps children were there longer than just a few hours. And even if children were only there for a few hours, the state of Arizona, they're the ones who determine whether or not a place is a child care facility. The way that we described what we understood to be happening there to Arizona Department of Health spokesperson, he said, well, he's not familiar with this particular case. What we described would mean that it's a child care center, and it's not licensed for that. There hasn't even been an application put in for that.
Auda, you got a copy of the Office of Refugee Resettlement Spanish language video that parents are required to watch in order to reunify with their child. In the very first minute, it says to get a sponsor manual at a website. This is what happens.
Identificados en este video, por favor consulte el manual del patrocinador proveído por su encargado del caso. Usted también puede descargar el manual del patrocinador del sitio www.
But that website they instruct parents to visit, you found the URL they gave is broken?
That link has been broken for quite a long time. I don't remember when it first went down, but it's been several months, if not longer than a year. This video is available in English and Spanish. What we do know is that a lot of people who were separated from their children don't speak either language. They're indigenous peoples, and the video is not available in that language. This video is an outdated video, and it was made for sponsors in general, I believe some years ago. I'm guessing 2 or more years ago. And that website is down.
And it doesn't work. Finally, we just have 30 seconds. How are politicians responding? This issue of a black site of children in Phoenix, Arizona.
There's been a lot of outrage on the part of lawmakers, on the part of policymakers, on the part of the community. There will be a press conference today directly in front of that office, and a lot of lawmakers have issued statements. We are working with a reporter in Phoenix who's going to bring us more about the fallout from our story.
Aura Bagadawan, thank you for being with us. Immigration reporter for Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting. We'll link to your piece that you just broke. Defense contractor detained migrant kids in vacant Phoenix office building. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, human rights activist and attorney Jennifer Harbury. As we continue to look at President Trump's zero-tolerance policy at the U.S. border, we turn now to Texas-based human rights lawyer Jennifer Harbury, who's lived in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas for more than 40 years. Her husband, Efraim Bamaca Velasquez, a Mayan comandante, was disappeared after he was captured by the Guatemalan army in the 80s. After a long protest campaign, Harbury found U.S. involvement in the murder and cover-up of her husband. Now she continues to work with people fleeing violence in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, who've come to the United States seeking asylum, and makes connections between U.S. foreign policy and people seeking political asylum in Central America. We spoke just a week ago in Brownsville, Texas, when I met with her right there along the border. I started by asking her what happens when people follow the U.S. government's instructions and attempt to apply for political asylum at a legal port of entry.
We're part of various treaties on refugees, and we executed those into our own domestic laws. It's in there. And it says the person under 8 U.S.C. 1225 goes up to the port of entry, knocks on the door, and literally says, I'm in danger, I need to apply for asylum. And as I said earlier, they then go to a credible fear interview, and then to a detention center initially, and they'll be put in proceedings before an immigration judge. The norm that has always been in place for either group of people, whether they went by the river or went across the bridge, is that if they've got perfectly good identification, they've never committed a crime, they're not a threat to anyone, they're just on the run from the cartels, and they have legal status relatives, citizen or LPR, who will take them in and sponsor them and pay all their expenses.
What does LPR mean?
Legal permanent resident. If they have all of that, then they have always been released. Now, since Trump came in, it had started declining even before Trump, but then it just took a belly flop. And it's part of the campaign of punishment, not of cartel people, but of the victims of the cartels. So if you go in and ask for asylum, pass your credible fear test, you're detained. And the conditions are horrific. We had one woman who had had surgery to repair her pelvis, the one that was kidnapped. And they gave her such terribly...
What do you mean, the one who was kidnapped?
As I'd stated in our other segment, she had gone north with her 8-year-old daughter fleeing the cartels. And as they neared Reynosa on the border, their van was pursued, and it flipped over and crashed. Her daughter was crushed to death, 8 years old. She suffered, the mother, a terrible fracture of her pelvis, her femur, her arm, and a big gash around her throat where she went through the windshield. They could have taken her head off. She was several months in the hospital in Reynosa, hobbled across the bridge on a walker, and told last year, we don't do that anymore, go away. She went back and was kidnapped at the foot of the bridge. Anyone looking like a refugee is going to be kidnapped because the cartels have figured out you've got someone up north that loves you and is going to go find the money. That's what happened. We then were able to bring her across. She applied for what's called parole, similar to bond, and was eligible. She had eligibility for 2 categories, severe medical condition, plus many legal relatives eager to take her, and no criminal background. Denied. She was in there for close to a year, and the surgical site began to reopen given the terrible conditions.
In her abdomen.
In her hip. In her hip. It began to open again, and that requires immediate IV antibiotics, but they gave her such inadequate pills for for antibiotics that she became resistant to all of them. Then the infection went into her thigh bone, and she basically was going septic. After a year, they kind of threw her at me as she was in a wheelchair in horrible pain. I was able to get her to her relatives. She's undergone 3 surgeries, and they didn't have to amputate her leg. That's how we're treating the victims of the cartels.
To understand something, Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, said domestic violence and gang violence will no longer be accepted as grounds for political asylum. So she would not be accepted under...
That's correct. And a woman whose children I represent in another case, this was back from '09, but it's a very typical case, actually, and it shows you what's going to happen now. She had an extremely abusive partner from Reynosa. They grew up almost next door to each other.
Reynosa's just over the border in Mexico.
Just over the river. And he beat her so often and then tried to burn the trailer they were living in with her and the kids inside it that she went to the police, got protective orders, and he got deported back to Reynosa and immediately joined the cartels. And all her relatives said, he's talking about how he's going to murder you, he's going to burn you, he's driving around with the cartels with these heavy weapons, don't ever come back. She was stopped by police after her waitressing shift, and they said, you know, faulty brake light or something, a very typical excuse, and was immediately turned over to Border Patrol with all of her friends screaming, don't send her back, she won't survive the week. She was begging and crying. Before the courts were even open and before she could contact any lawyer, just at dawn, she was forced back across the bridge into Reynosa. And 5 days later, they found her incinerated. And her children have to live with that. There was a child that was 10 that is suicidal off and on, and that's our fault.
In the case of the woman that you described called Laura, who was forced back, we had Sarah Stillman on, who did a piece for The New Yorker about this.
Yes.
She told the Border Patrol agent, you are sending me straight to the slaughterhouse. And she said that her deportation, she said to him, my death will be on your hands. She turned to Agent Garza and said, when I am found dead, it will be on your conscience.
That's exactly what she said, and that was confirmed by 2 people who were deported with her. They were picked up with her in her car. They all went across the bridge together. And they all said the same thing. She was weeping and crying, desperate.
Where was she found?
In Reynosa, in an incinerated car just down near the river. The second day he found out she was there and he rammed her car because she was trying to find a coyote to rush her across. And it's $1,500 to pay the cartels for permission to cross. So her family was rounding up nickels and dimes, dollars, anything they could find. She went down to make arrangements, and he rammed her car, dragged her out of the car in front of her small child, and bit her ear off, basically. And her cousin, who is a very feisty woman, hit him with a log, and they escaped. And a few days after that, she was found unidentifiable. At first, they didn't know if the cadaver was male or female, but the family immediately recognized the mark of the car. She'd been strangled partially and burned. The cause of death was strangulation and burns, and she was tied to the steering wheel.
So explain what you're doing, how you're fighting back.
On many different fronts, right? For one thing, I want to make sure people make it to the door of the port of entry to ask for asylum. First, they were all turned away last year. Then the American Immigration Council filed a class action, and then they stopped turning people away, at least if they were with somebody else. They started doing that again just about a month ago, almost unilaterally across the United States border, just about every crossing. In Reynosa and Roma, very close to here, something almost worse was happening. The refugee moms with their babies and men who were terrified and dads with their kids came to the bridges and they were told, we're full. Sit on the bridge and wait your turn. And of course they're full because people are illegally being denied parole and bond once they're taken into the system. So some of them are in there for 2 years, 2.5 years, year and a half, And so, of course, you know, the places are full. But Border Patrol made all of those families, 30 to 50 people I counted, sit on the bridge, some of them 10 days, in Roma 16 days. It was 100 degrees out back then, and the heat index was 108. Border Patrol agents would not let them sit in the Progresso waiting room, which holds 100 people, is air conditioned and has bathrooms. The people sitting on the bridge were not allowed to use the bathrooms. They had to go to a duty-free store as long as it was open until nightfall, and then I guess they used coffee cans. Church people, civilians from both sides of the river, we started running to those bridges with water, with Pedialyte, with Pampers, with extra clothes, trying to help them. And then suddenly they were gone. After Senator Merkley's experience down here, having the police called on him because he wanted to check on the welfare of the children that were separated. So then what happened is Border Patrol stood at the middle of the bridge, 3 men across, big husky men usually, to make sure they had papers, quote unquote, before they would be allowed onto the U.S. half of the bridge. And if they had entered illegally into Mexico, didn't have transit visas, or their transit visas had been stolen, they would call Mexican immigration and make them come up the bridge, grab the people, and drag them back into Mexico to either jail or deport them. So word went out about that really fast, and everybody ran to the coyotes to get across the river. Well, kids drown all the time in the river. You know, not long ago, a woman with 2 small children and an infant was on one of those rafts going across, and the 3-year-old fell in, and she couldn't save him with the baby in her arms. So she was begging the coyote to stop. He wouldn't. The child drowned. So we've driven them into the arms of these ruthless traffickers. A lot of the coyotes are now, in Reynosa at least, selling people to the cartels. That way they have no cost, pure profit, and they get another tip from the cartels themselves. So we force them into danger, and if they manage to get over here, now we punish them again by taking their kids away. If they go legally across the bridge, they face long-term detention in hideous prison-like conditions. And the truth is, it's intended to force them to give up their claims for asylum, to which they are legally entitled to hearing in front of a judge, and just say, okay, I don't want asylum after all, I'm going home. One kid that we had was 18. His eldest brother was badly murdered, axe murdered by the local cartels. The second brother fled to the United States and was deported back and killed shortly thereafter. The 18-year-old was turned away with his parents at the bridge several times, finally got across, and after a year in prison-like conditions said, I can't take it, I'm just going to go home. I'll just try to survive. And he went home. Another man with a bullet hole in his stomach went home. And that's what this administration wants. We want to drive them home. We'll take your kids, we'll imprison you for years, we'll make you sit on the bridge and die of heat stroke, whatever we got to do, we're going to drive you home.
And explain to someone like the former Houston police officer that we flew on a plane with yesterday coming here to Brownsville, who was asking why should these illegal immigrants be allowed into our country?
Well, I've said before, reason number one, we're all human beings. We're supposed to take care of each other. Jordan has something like 600,000 refugees in a population of 9 million. Now, that puts us to shame. Quite apart from the moral and ethical issues and our own heritage as Americans, my father arrived at Ellis Island when he was 11. I mean, this is who we are. Quite aside from our national identity, our government helped to create the cartels. Most of the heads of the cartels are former military intelligence leaders who were trained in the United States, armed by the United States, worked carefully with the United States during the genocide era, as documented in the United Nations Truth Commission report. And as I said earlier, President Clinton ended up issuing an apology to the people of Guatemala. But we basically created this cadre of people and worked with them till the end of the genocide, which left 200,000 people murdered, not killed in the crossfire, and 660 Mayan villages wiped off the map. Those people who...
And you're just talking about in Guatemala alone.
Guatemala alone. Those people, after the war ended, were looking around for something profitable. Most of them were already in the drug trade. Colonel Alpérez, Julio Roberto Alpérez, who was my husband, one of my husband's torturers, was being paid for the information he gave about Everardo while he was torturing him. He got $44,000 from the CIA at a remote jungle base not long after a specific torture session. After the disclosures happened, he was flown to the United States, despite the fact that he's not eligible for any kind of visa, and lived with his entire family for 10 years not far from the CIA.
I want you to tell that story of Everardo, of Efraim Bamaka Velasquez, your husband, for especially young people who maybe weren't even born at that time. But to understand the roots of the violence today, talk about what happened. Your campaigning for him was, you know, one of the remarkable moments of protest in your protest and also what you found out.
Well, as you said earlier, he was a Mayan Indian campesino. He had grown up starving. He was involved in what I call the Mayan resistance movement, which was part of the URNJ resistance forces during the massacre campaign, et cetera, et cetera. He was captured alive. He was one of their highest-ranking officials, and he was captured alive on March the 12th, 1992, by the military. And they realized who he was and how much valuable intelligence he had. So instead of killing him outright, which is what they did with 99.9% of the prisoners of war, they kept him alive with the help of physicians while they tortured him long-term with the goal of breaking him for his information. And I'm pretty sure from the evidence I have in the CIA files that he survived 2.5 to 3 years of torture at the hands of the military intelligence people. That team of his torturers, including the former president of Guatemala, they were all intelligence paid officials for the military who were also working for the CIA. I set out to search for him as soon as he disappeared because we weren't convinced he'd been killed in combat. The Army faked his death to better take advantage of his intelligence. They didn't want Amnesty to be crying out, or the UN interfering, or the Inter-American Commission.
And didn't you even go to a military base where they said, this is the coffin that Everardo is in?
I went to a military base where they said he might be buried under the base, along with between 500 to 2,000 other people. I'm pretty sure that's not where he is. But they faked his death. They told us he was in an unmarked grave in Retoluleo. And at the same time, about a week after he disappeared, they sent a memo to both the White House and the State Department saying, oh, the Army just captured Bamaka alive. He's a very, very important catch. They're going to fake his death so they can better take advantage of his information, and so they can torture him. That was 6 days after he was picked up. I ended up on a long series of hunger strikes, 3 total, one of them for 32 days in front of the palace down there.
Back with human rights attorney Jennifer Harbury on her husband's death in 20 seconds.
Ríos de sangre los que lloró la tierra después de tanta masacre en tiempos de la guerra. Y no pienses que esto se quedó solo en los 80. Tantos pueblos arrasados de una forma tan cruenta, tan violenta la manera de quitarle agua al pez. El ejército asesinó una y otra vez. Como piensan desde el odio hacen todo al revés, defendiendo intereses de los ricos tal vez. Usted no se haya dado cuenta, pero el exterminio.
We returned to our conversation with immigration lawyer Jennifer Harbury when I was in Brownsville, Texas last week, where she represents people seeking political asylum in the U.S. I played for a clip of the documentary Dirty Secrets, Jennifer Everardo and the CIA in Guatemala, a film about the murder of her husband, the Mayan guerrillan comandante Efraim Bamaka Velasquez, in the 80s.
I want to save my husband's life. I'm not going to allow him to be tortured for 2.5 years in a secret army prison and then shot to death or assassinated as if he was some kind of garbage. I'd rather die. I would literally rather die, and I'm prepared to do so if I have to.
I want people to understand what it means to have someone disappeared in their family, and I want people to understand what that whole system of terror against a civilian population is about. When you're looking for someone you care about, you don't sleep anymore. You just stop sleeping. You wonder every single minute, am I fighting hard enough? Are they shooting him right now? Are they burning him right now? Are
they pulling his fingernails out right now? You know, maybe I should be trying harder. Maybe I should be fighting harder.
That's a clip from Dirty Secret's Jennifer Everardo and the CIA in Guatemala. This is when you were on hunger strike in Guatemala City outside the U.S. Embassy there?
The very first hunger strike was in front of the Politecnica, close to the U.S. Embassy, but it's their Army intelligence building, and it looks like the Wicked Witch of the West castle with cannons and machine gun turrets. That was 7 days. The second one that appears in this clip was in front of the National Palace, the government seat, and that was 32 days water only. And then the very last one was in Washington because they weren't assisting me. And that lasted 12 days before the disclosures came out with Congressman Torricelli that my husband had indeed been killed by military intelligence officials who were also working as paid informants of the CIA.
And link that to what we're seeing today. So that was the violence of the 1980s, the U.S.-backed death squads in Guatemala. You really helped to expose this through your own personal experience. How does that relate to people coming over the border in the United States? Well, let's take the example of Julio Roberto Alpérez, the colonel, right? He was witness torturing my husband in person. He's also known by the CIA to have helped murder Michael Devine, a U.S. citizen innkeeper in Guatemala. There are also plenty of CIA files that say he excelled in his task of liquidating not only the guerrillas, but all of their sympathizers, in other words, villagers, in the highlands during the worst of the campaign, and that he was somewhat brutal and not well liked by his fellow military. So start with that person as an example. He received $44,000 shortly after he, in person, tortured my husband. He injected him with an unknown substance out of a cylinder of gas that made his body swell enormously, so badly that one arm and leg were bandaged because they'd hemorrhaged. And he was bending over the torture table. Torricelli named him as one of those people. DEA records show that he's also on the DEA corrupt officer list. He's known to be a drug runner, a cartel leader. What did they do? When the disclosures were made by Torricelli, the CIA protected him. He's their asset. They sent him and his whole family to Washington, where he lived happily for 10 years in secret, not far from the CIA. When I found out, so that I would go file a Torture Victims Protection Act case on him, the CIA notified him and immediately sent him back to Guatemala so that he could avoid any consequences. And the DEA is not allowed to take him down because he's a CIA asset and partner for many, many years, and that's forbidden. So there are many high-level cartel people who engaged in genocide and daily acts of torture, who now are the heads of cartels. The terrifying Zeta gang, for example, was out of Guatemala and formed by military leaders. It's also composed of many collaborators in the military still and by different police people. So these cartels are fantastically armed and trained to carry out village-by-village massacres, let alone bending people to their will. They're terrifying. I mean, some women from the Rio Negro massacre back in 1980 were not long ago found in the city dumped with their teeth pulled out and their breasts and hands amputated. And those kinds of mutilations, we remember. Those are those military people. These are not street gangs. These are not kids. These are not people we have no idea who they are. The head of the Salvatrucha gang was just discovered to be a military leader in Guatemala who'd been working in the anti-gang unit hand in glove with U.S. military people. They really didn't know. So that takes us to MS-13, to another country, that's El Salvador, who President Trump says he is protecting us from the MS-13 gangs in Salvador. How does that relate to what you're talking about in Guatemala? Well, of course, the MS-13 had a lot of its roots in the United States, and then those people were deported back to Salvador. There's a whole lot of history where actually that happened in the United States, just as these military intelligence people that went back down there. Those people are firmly entrenched
And the U.S. is not so much going after them as they are the victims of those people. The people running up here, the woman with 2 small children on her back, barefoot, the 15-year-old who's 7 months pregnant from a gang rape, the young man, 20 years old, with 17 bullets through his legs that could show me the scars. A 20-year-old who fled north after the second time the gangs told him they would kill him, and the people close to him if he didn't join. He's cannon fodder at that age. And he said no again, took his wife and baby and fled north, called his mom to say, I'm coming back for the rest of you, I'm coming right now. The day after he left, the gangs had bludgeoned his mother and younger brother to death and had gang raped his 12-year-old sister, who was in a mental hospital unable to speak. That young man has been sent back to Salvador.
I want to go back to the Zetas and their connection to special forces, to training. The Zetas, a 2009 U.S. diplomatic cable that was published by WikiLeaks, shows at least one Zeta, former infantry lieutenant named Rogelio Lopez, trained at Fort Bragg in North Carolina.
Well, many people, such as Julio Roberto Alpérez, who I keep mentioning because he's such a template, right? Many of them were trained at the School of the Americas in torture and kidnapping techniques, and they used them. And then when the war was over, they kept using them in the same way. And if we would release the files on the human rights violations and massacres committed by all of those people, then the war crimes claims that people are valiantly trying to bring in Central America, something could be done. Those people could be put in prison. And then maybe we would have a lessening of the terror that's being used to drive people north in order to more easily run the drug cartels.
Where are the Zetas based?
They were up here for quite a while, near Reynosa. They came originally out of Guatemala and southern Mexico. They were up here and owned the riverfront here for quite a while. They were pushed out a few years ago by the Golfo cartel. But in Reynosa now, they captured, the army had captured the highest level person, and they've captured or killed several lower level ones. So that's fractured, and the Zetas are coming back, and they're all fighting each other, and they're fighting the Mexican army and the Mexican Marines. So there's nonstop shootouts. Anyone that's deported to Reynosa, they're lucky if they can get off the bridge without being immediately grabbed, because they know they'll have someone up north. People struggling north, with their babies and stuff, they're lucky if they don't get trafficked and grabbed. It's completely unsafe in Reynosa, and the Zetas are clearly trying to come back because a group of people recently paid off the correct cartel, what's left of the Golfo, got to mid-river and were shot to death with no explanation. And that's almost for sure the Zetas coming back saying, oh, you paid the wrong guys.
We're talking to Jennifer Harbury, the well-known human rights activist and attorney, and she is also well-known now all over the country for having gotten the news organization ProPublica the tape of children, babies, infants, toddlers, children of tender age crying out for their parents, saying, Mama, Papi. Let's go to that clip.
Cuando saquen la comida. Ay, no,
So, Jennifer Harbury, you're the person who got this audio tape out. Describe how this happened.
Well, the true hero, of course, is the whistleblower. And he was present in the building nearby to these children who had just been separated from their parents recently and who were just crying desperately and in fear, the way you just heard. That whistleblower brought the tape to me, and we discussed the legal issues and stuff, and the whistleblower authorized me to get it through to the press, which is what we did.
Do you know, can you tell us what detention center it's from?
I'd best not.
And how old the children were?
The children that you hear weeping would have been possibly as young as 3 up to 6 or 7. And in the background, not weeping, are some older children that are still minors.
And one child who keeps on repeating the phone number of her aunt.
Remarkable.
Has she been reunited with her family?
I don't think she has yet. I may be wrong on that, but I believe she's still trying to get reunited with her family.
Even though her mother has called up and said that this is my daughter, and her aunt has confirmed that that is her number.
Even with that. And
so a judge in San Diego has just ruled that these children must be reunited with their parents. Under 5 and 14 days, all children, in 30 days. So what's going to happen? Is this possible?
It's possible if they really want to put the time and attention into it that they must. The problem, of course, is that so many people within ICE and Border Patrol feel that these refugees are just kind of trash and should not be coming to our country in the first place, that things can't be that bad back home, even though you can read that they have the highest murder rates in the world. So I'm not sure how hard they're going to try. There can be spelling mistakes in a name. And of course, in most of Central America, instead of saying June the 10th, 1984, they're going to say 10th June, 1984. So that can be transposed sometimes, making it harder to find the person. But if they want to find the parents, of course they can. And if they want to release them immediately, of course they can. They always used to.
So as we sit here, a major protest about to take place right behind us at the federal courthouse, a courthouse you know well right here in Brownsville. What message do you have for people across the country?
I think first we have to wake up and understand the basic flaw in the administration's argument that they're protecting us from cartels and terrorists and so forth. The people we are punishing are moms, kids, fathers, young teenagers that don't want to be trafficked, young men that are saying, no, I won't work with the cartels. They're running for their lives. If the cartels wanted to send people to cross the river, as I said earlier, they can buy the airport. They have bought several police units in Texas already. They can buy well, a whole elite piece of the police force here not long ago was found out to have been working with the cartels. That was very.
You're in Brownsville.
Not in Brownsville, up towards McAllen in Hidalgo County. And it's inevitable with that kind of money. They have no need to send a desperate person who speaks no English in raggedy clothing to try to swim the river. They don't need that. They just buy the passports, they buy the visas that are legitimate, and they can do whatever they want. So we need to understand the difference. Once we understand the difference, I think it becomes very clear what we have to do. Protect the refugees. Protect them. Don't leave them on the bridge to go into heat stroke. Don't leave them to miscarry a child after you've been gang raped. I mean, what are we thinking, that we would declare war and bring down total abuse on people that have just run for their lives?
In the countries they're mainly running from, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala.
And much of Mexico.
And Mexico.
Much of Mexico, and also parts of Africa. Not the cartels there, but genocide and anti-gay stuff.
In places like Honduras, where the U.S., back to when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, the U.S. supported a coup in Honduras, and then even the Organization of American States saying the last election was not legitimate. The U.S. continues to support that government. How does that link what's happening there to the violence there?
We keep supporting our military allies. It was President Otto Perez Molina in Guatemala was one of the intelligence leaders responsible for my husband's 3 years of torture. And they knew that when he was running for office, and the State Department still covered for him, saying he was a reformist, for example. But what we're doing is, through our intelligence agencies, we're still giving massive support and protection to keep these military units in place and in total power over each of these countries so that they'll do what we want with their countries. And in return, we cast a blind eye while they set up these hideous drug-running cartels that are chasing these people up here, and which eventually are going to land right here. And there already are signs of that in Texas. And if we haven't done our part to put those people in prison by releasing our files and halting military support for them, through elections and otherwise, then we're going to get what we deserve.
Human rights attorney Jennifer Harbury. I spoke to her on the border in Brownsville, Texas last week. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman.